Right, slate tombstones, one of my favourite things. This is a reworking of something I gave last year. So for those of you who've seen the presentation, there'll be a few new slides and a few more examples for you to see. We're glad to have your company. What I'm going to talk about tonight includes why we should look at this bunch of Midlands headstones that I'm going to be referring to. We're going to be using them to explore mortality imagery. So I'm just looking at a particular group of these headstones that include mortality images, and then group these under various categorizations, including death and father time as a narrative, scenes of death ambushing people in the midst of life, death and the corruption of one's own body. In other words, death of the self and how that's depicted. And then we'll look at the Christian belief that death leads to the day of judgment and resurrection. I can't talk about makers and making these headstones or much about lettering and epitaphs, all things that you could, but in the interest of time, we'll skip past those for now. And I should mention that the main landowners of the slate quarries were the Herricks and the Earl of Stamford, and one of the Herrick family ledger stones from Leicester Cathedral is what's shown on screen, a fully painted up one, which is really lovely. So Swithland slate, technically a misnomer. It's a catch-all term for a few group of rocks local to the Charnwood Forest area of Leicestershire. So Leicestershire and Rutland are highlighted in blue on the UK map, and the Charnwood Forest is the blue triangle on the close-up. So that's the geographical location of the source of these rocks, but the headstones themselves spread all the way into surrounding counties and have been found as far afield as London. To give you a few date ranges, the rocks themselves are Cambrian, so over 500 million years old. Quarrying of them, at least on an industrial scale, takes place from at least Roman times, but there was a real boom in the 18th century, but all the Swithland quarries had closed by the 1880s. But the tombstones made of this stone, more research is needed for a complete chronology, but the main period is the second half of the 17th century through to the 19th century. Other local slates were available from the 1830s onwards, and Welsh slate was easier to bring in from around then too. So most of the headstones we'll look at tonight are 18th century and Swithland. In the 1780s, John Throsby described the slate quarry's work as a toilsome and perilous occupation. But it was also, as well as an industrial undertaking, it was a sight to be seen in the landscape, something really unprecedented, and visitors would go and have a look. And Throsby himself said, well, one of these pits I dreaded and remembered well, whilst some few years since, viewing a steep precipice here, whose large rocky sides struck me with sensations of the sublime, I was near falling into another. Not much of a risk now. You can barely see the big pit at Swithland Wood to fence it off good and proper, so you can't see very much, unfortunately, anymore. In Roman times, it was mainly used as roof tiles. This is true of the medieval period as well, mainly on high status buildings of the city or county, but during its boom time from the 17th century and particularly in the 18th and into the 19th, it's used for almost everything from paving and capping to making troughs, sinks, drains, cheese presses, sundials, clocks, fireplaces, posts, a big business in milestones, for example, all sorts, and it characterizes the local villages very strongly. These slates contribute so much to the character and distinctiveness of our churchyards, which don't necessarily get enough notice, perhaps because they are literally overshadowed by church buildings and contents, but they do want to be seen and read. They call to us with inscriptions such as "Reader, whoe'er thou art," or "Kind spectator, pause," and so on, and they're asking for our attention. of Loughborough Parish Churchyard. Thoresby said in 1790 that the task of looking over the gravestones in the churchyard did not suit either my inclination or the time I had to spare. They show that the Swithland slate pits are near, for I never saw a burial ground so full in my life of those slate stones, with inscriptions, many of which are excellently cut. And so this is one of my nearest churchyards, actually, so I'm using it as an example of how these things might be at risk. This churchyard was cleared in the 1960s, and the headstones cemented into the kind of strange configurations and at odd angles that encourage misuse and accelerate erosion. So why should we worry about that and study these? Well, it's such a valuable group, this bunch of headstones. So long as they're not misused or mismanaged, they do survive really well and generally in good condition. So every detail they bear can tell us about life in their times. Because the inscriptions have the potential to stay very sharp due to the properties of the stone, they tell us much about the local social, religious and industrial history, and about the material and visual culture of their time. They're dense, so they take very detailed carving well. They're durable, so they are real survivors. Headstones of less durable stones are now obliterated, whereas some of these are nearly 400 years old and still legible to us, as well as being artistic and imaginative. And because despite their qualities, they're hugely at risk. I was going to say gravely, but that seemed the wrong thing to do. I won't depress you with lots of pictures of neglected headstones, but there are plenty. This is a worry because they're a finite resource due to their age, the material they're made of being now extinct, and because of recent restrictions on headstone design, these things will never be seen again, and we're losing them by degrees almost every day. The point made, stern word of caution out to the way, onto happier aspects. Earlier survivors, this was thought to be the oldest surviving Swithland slate headstone in Leicestershire at Thurgeston, because the date on it, the date of death of the rector, Elias Travers, was 1641. But Margaret Grief has shown this was probably not set up until the 1660s at the earliest. But you can see that it's a curious shape. It's not regular, so you can tell it's an early example, that from the inscription as well. They hadn't yet clearly got onto selling standardized size and shapes of slate for the headstone purposes, so it's still an early one. Tombstones, therefore, can demonstrate some of the most interesting and challenging aspects of studying commemoration, because as evidence, they need to be handled extremely carefully. They might not be what they appear. They're not necessarily contemporary with the events that they record. They may have been moved. The whole morphology of the churchyard over time has made sure of that, and churchyard management since has arguably been a bit of a mess. One can see how quickly styles and skills develop in carving these headstones. This is an example of a very distinctive style, roughly in the Vale of Belvoir area and beyond too, they're locally known as the Belvoir Angels. So they're not purely from Belvoir and they're not necessarily angels, but please note on this one, the crossbones and hourglass on the example at the right from around 1728. This little motif brings us to our crash course in mortality imagery. So we're going to talk about death using a visual language of symbolism that evokes narrative and also biblical quotations. It's a particular feature of the Midlands slates, not only here, but noticeably here. So here are some examples. We've got some literal examples showing skulls, skeletons, scattered bones, also depictions of the dead body, corpses, and resurrecting cadavers. Again, on the quite literal side of things, but may also be appropriated, are the sexton's tools. So they're often wielded by animated figures of death or Father Time, including the sexton's pick and shovel and scythe. They also depict graves, tombs, headstones, urns, and sometimes mourners or weepers at more fictional sites of burial. On the more symbolic side of things, the accoutrements of death and father time, hourglasses, clocks, sundials representing the time of life passing, the same with candles, tapers and snuffers, torches, the light of life burning down and being snuffed out, and also weapons such as a dart, arrow or spear, the moment of death being encapsulated by a strike, a physical violent moment. Also trumpets and crumbling obelisks and towers, that relates to the idea of Judgment Day and what would happen. Wings of various sorts, threads of life being cut, also globes and mirrors representing worldly things and vanity, and the Ouroboros, the snake eating its tail, representing eternity. They'll crop up in the slides to come. So this narrative of death and father time personified, locked in an unending struggle, was popular in early modern print culture. Here from Francis Quayle's Hieroglyphics of 1638, an emblem book, life is equated with a burning candle. Death and time argue over the moment at which it should be snuffed out, and death says, "This brisk and bold-faced light does burn too bright. Darkness alone adorns my throne. My day is darkest night." So when we look at our first example from Newtown Linford, 1683, commemorating John Boney or Bonny and his 5 whiffs, on the back of the headstone, which is a very early and interesting shape headstone, it's very wide at the base, is this what looks like a stick man with a very clear sort of visage, but not a very clear body. But we know this is meant to be a skull, a skeleton representing death, because he's wielding that arrow, that dart. See it a bit more clearly about 40 years later, this at Wotton in the Vale of 1723, where the little skeleton on the shoulder of the stone is a bit more defined. You can see his rib cage and pelvis, and he's probably holding the Ouroboros in his other hand. Leaping onwards another 40 years or so, at Newtown Linford is this great stone by Hind of Swithland, which shows both figures in their stock form, Father Time with his scythe as an aged man, and Death as a skeleton with the arrow, the dart that will snuff out life, and the shovel waiting to claim the dead. This is all to be seen in other visual culture. Here, a funeral invitation in particular. You can see all the elements we've looked at just there, just about. But you'll also see it in various etchings, trade cards, memento mori objects, jewelry and ornaments, things like that, wall paintings in churches, illuminations in manuscripts, or illustrations in printed books. Sometimes they're copied exactly, but whilst inspired by visual works available to them, to what degree that appropriation by carvers was done is unclear. I think the slate carver's imagination and creativity does deserve plenty of credit, as there are clearly some highly original works. They were artists just as much as designers of other visual media. Such as this staggering presentation of the conflict relationship between death and time in that old narrative. This gorgeous stone at Kirby Muxloe has 2 very large shoulder panels with relief carvings of those by now familiar characters facing off, as it were, across the top of the stone. Father Time with scythe and hourglass, Death with spear in hand and waving the Ouroboros, the symbol of eternity, at him as if to signal his ultimate victory over all. Life, how short, eternity, how long. I love that one. But to divert to a group of tombs that latch onto this idea of of death with his dart, or the death stroke as a moment that could be captured visually, I couldn't resist a suite of headstones by Thomas Wood of Bingham, but just to mention that it also pops up in inscriptions themselves. So here one mentions the fatal dart as the inevitable moment of death. Many headstones do that. It had been brought to life vividly in this tomb to Lady Elizabeth Nightingale in Westminster Abbey by Roubiliac, whose achingly stylish skeletal figure of death kind of dramatically emerges from a set of doors below this monument and aims his spear ready to make that strike. Nightingale, by the by, died in 1731 during a premature birth brought on by a flash of lightning. And this is apparently then filtering to the provinces. So sort of 20 years later or so, you get this death stroke appearing visually in the work of carver like Thomas Wood of Bingham. This early example, the skeleton darts out at a young person, crushing the hourglass with the sands of their life, and his arrow in the air about to strike. And the inscription refers to not health or age or human art can shun death's fatal painted dart. And Wood takes this further and becomes quite well known for it. Here's one of his works at Wotton in the Vale of around 1813, where Death is jumping out and pointing his dart even at Father Time, who sort of jumps back startled. There's a good inscription on this one, by the way, about the sort of vain flattery of tomb inscriptions, which is interesting. This other example from Neaton to Elizabeth Gilbert, who died in 1815, there's similar going on here. And I like the use of domestic furniture to help Death take his aim, to facilitate his sting. I mean, look how his raised arm as well goes from being carved in relief inside the lunette, but outside of the lunette, it's an incision, it's incised instead. So we've got different styles of carving. This may just be a mistake, but I like to think it's almost as though the arrow is coming from a different dimension, entering our very ordinary domestic life at an unexpected moment. So all that, I think, has introduced the personification of death, who comes to claim you. So now we'll look at depictions of the dead self, that is one's own corruptible flesh. The depiction of the dying and the dead is ancient. If we rewind a few centuries, in medieval Christianity in particular, were teachings about the art of dying a good death in order to achieve salvation. This developed visually into narratives like The Three Living and the Three Dead, or the Dance of Death. So that famous, one of the earliest, Three Living and Three Dead in England from the Delisle Psalter of the early 14th century illustrates that really well. The three kings mirrored by three decaying corpses who are reanimated and saying to them, what you are, we were, and what we are, you will be, a sentiment that is repeated often on tombstones. So the imagery may have moved on a little by the early modern period, but the message remained the same. And here, if we fast forward back to our period, another development was that coming from the medical field. So by the early modern period, there's a newly scientific obsession with cadavers, anatomy and dissection. And I've illustrated this slide because it happens to relate to a Leicestershire-born surgeon, William Cheselden. His Anatomy of 1713 and Osteographia of 1733 contain now familiar engravings of skeletons and cadavers, notably including animated skeletons in human poses, sitting, kneeling, praying, leaning, slumping, and these were used as textbooks for more than a century after I think some of these images would have been very well known. And the imagination of the dead self was projected onto some church monuments from the medieval period onwards, popular, for example, in the cadaver effigies you've heard about. And I think this is a headstone equivalent, but of a much later time. This is the late 18th century. In this wonderful carving, which is getting harder to see, a decaying corpse is shown within a tomb. The drawing by the great Frederick Burgess might help you make that out. It's like we've got a periscope and we're peeping into what's going on underground ahead of the expected day of judgment. This poignant version of that theme at Desborough shows Anne and Harriet Holmes together in death, apparently seen within a brick-lined tomb, but appearing as they would have on their deathbed, having just died. And I contend that there is another form of sort of death portraiture, if you like, to be found on headstones that's overlooked but extremely interesting. If you had a lot of money and you could afford to have an accurate sculpture or effigy carved on a church monument, that really signaled that you were one of the highest status people around. But headstones were more within the reach of ordinary people, certainly the professional classes, but even some working individuals could have afforded a headstone. So the fact that there is some potential portraiture on there is really quite interesting. These are clearly individuals. You can tell from their different hairstyles and relative weights that they're different people. The two on the left are contemporary. One executed more skillfully than the other, but they clearly show them in sheets rather than in clothes, I think shrouds. The highly unusual one on the right, which as you can see is at risk of deterioration, that's one laid as paving around Loughborough Church, looks like a long-haired person with the hair down, but it's actually someone with a short styled hairdo of its time, wearing a shroud which is tied at the top. Very unusual, I think. So death itself can also be suggested by skulls and bones. It's kind of shorthand for the same kinds of things we've been looking at. This slide just gives you an idea of the range of styles and the level of realism adopted in the carver's art. These are all in Leicestershire. The tombstone really emphasises that you're in the world of the living for such a short time that it's worth spending much of that time preparing for a good death. Because the Christian belief was that after death you'd face judgment, and this would determine where you spent your eternity, in heaven or in hell. This stone does that very succinctly. It shows a globe on a pedestal, put in context by being encircled by the Ouroboros, representing eternity. How small this makes our time on earth look. The banner surrounding the biblical quotation, "The great globe shall dissolve, but eternity hath no end," can be seen above. In other words, your worldly attainments and attachments will be stripped from you by death and mean nothing thereafter. Only the purity of your soul has currency at that point. These 18th century prints were very popular and drive this point home. These socialites in gaudy fashions and makeup, they're obviously high status, wealthy, nothing wrong with that in itself, but they're depicted as profligate, vain, in other words, sinners. All their worldly accoutrements will disappear. We all look the same when we're skeletons. This is death, the leveler. So beware and prepare for a good death, not a bad one. Sinners will be damned and the good rewarded in heaven. And speaking of heaven, if you visit St Margaret's Churchyard in Leicester on a sunny day, you'll find one of my favourites of these threatening moralising scenes on a large headstone in slate. This remarkable example has a tondo that's 17 inches across, in which death presents a globe to a dying man. Now, Frederick Burgess points out that this is a literal depiction, perhaps of Mark 8:36. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? That would be a bad death, one to be feared. Note the clock floating in the background. This is symbolic too. If we revisit Francis Quarles' hieroglyphics, it says, "Our life's a clock, and every gasp of breath breathes forth a warning grief till time shall strike a death." Frightening stuff indeed. Now, showing this example from Quorn Baptist Chapel Yard. The nonconformist chapel yards often have very similar headstones because they were made by the same stonemasons. This just shows that perhaps those who believed they'd led a good life or prepared for a good death might face the prospect differently. Although death on this tombstone comes in much the same way, at an unexpected hour as a gentleman reads in his chamber at night, with his dark close by snuffing out the candle of life, the man who's prepared for death can proclaim, as the inscription to the left says, "Though thou slayest, yet will I trust in my God." And you can see worldly vanity looking more like it's been cast to the ground, whereas the inscribed hopes of this person's soul are crowned and ready to ascend to heaven in sight of the eye of God. This one makes me think of the poet words of Elizabeth Grimston in her Miscellanea of 1604. Who can sit in his study and look on his hourglass and say not to himself, ut horta, sic fugit vita? Canst thou feel the wind beat on thy face, and canst thou forget that thou holdest thy tenement by a puff of wind? Canst thou shoot in the fields and not call to mind that as the arrow flieth in the air, so swiftly do thy days pass? Indeed they do. And what comes after? Some Christians believe that we will come to Judgment Day, when all people will be judged for their sins and their place in eternity will be decided. And tombstones have something to tell us about this belief. Now, this is a scriptural scene of the Last Judgment, which are only really common from the late 18th century onwards. This to William Hunt and his wife Catherine, court of around the 1780s, 1790s. Though the maker's name isn't visible today, Frederick Burgess knew, well, presumably saw 70 odd years ago that it was by Hind of Swithland. And I'll show you his drawing because, again, it makes the scene more obvious. This is a skeleton rising from its tomb on the Day of Judgment. As buildings crumble, the angels announce the presence of the Lord, and the dead shall be raised, as it says in miniature inside the tom dome. It's another motif that had appeared in the work of Roubiliac a few decades earlier in Westminster Abbey. So if we go back to Westminster Abbey, in this monument to William Hargrave, the governor of Gibraltar, who died in 1750, you can see that crumbling pyramid on the Day of Judgment when death is conquered and the dead is rising from the tomb. So it's being copied onto Leicestershire slate tombs slightly later, both quite faithfully as tumbling pyramids as here, but also like at Rothay in the form of crumbling spires or church towers. One of my favourite headstones on the theme of resurrection is at Blaby Churchyard, the tombstone of Thomas and Elizabeth Carrick, again by Hind of Swithland. If I show you this extreme close-up of one of the top shoulders, you'll see all the drama of that imagined moment of final judgment. The trumpets sound, the lightning strikes, while the shrouded dead person, now fleshy and perfect again, throws off the lid of his tomb and breaks out of it. Arise, ye dead, and come to judgment, as the book says. Later on, however, these ideas, at least insofar as being visualized, were sort of satirized and ridiculed, especially once science could prove the feasibility of people coming back to life from comas and so on, or this print spoofs off developments in galvanizing dead beings. So the kind of imagery we've been looking at that point does tail off around the end of the 18th and the early 19th century. It's almost completely gone by Victorian times, when the imagery starts to become a bit more sentimental and hopeful. So I'm going to sum up where we've got to, the ways in which death is depicted on Swithland slate headstones and others around the country. Firstly, the obvious, a gravestone signals that somebody dead is buried here. And I like this one. I like to think of it as almost an X marks the spot headstone. Secondly, we're told about it in the wisdom of words, the reflections that we're told by tomb inscriptions to bear in mind that we ought to live a good life in order to die a good death. thirdly, death personified is shown in the form of animated skeletons, often alongside Father Time. They also depict imaginations of the dead self as cadavers in various states of decay. Fifthly, various remains of the collective dead are invoked by depicting skulls and scattered bones. And finally, they also show us the prospect of the dead facing judgment and resurrecting. So though death in these many guises haunts the churchyard, that doesn't necessarily make them gloomy places, because after all, there is no life without death. Thank you very much for listening.